At 09:38 on July 25, 1944, the sky over St. Lo turned black. The first wave came in low, 600 American fighter bombers, sweeping the German front line. Behind them, in unbroken formation, roughly 1,500 heavy bombers crossed the Norman coast and unloaded on a rectangle of French farmland measuring 6,000 yards long and 2,200 yards wide. Some 380 medium bombers followed. In the space of a single morning, more than 3,000 tons of high explosive fell on the German positions west of St. Lo. The earth heaved. Hedgerows that had stood for 1,000 years vanished. The German soldiers below, men of the Panzer Lehr Division, the elite armoured training division of the Wehrmacht, were buried alive in their foxholes. Tanks were flipped onto their backs like dead beetles. Telephone lines went dead in every direction. The shock wave was felt in villages 40 kilometres away. It was not the first attempt. The day before, July 24, a portion of the bomber force had already dropped through partial cloud before the strike was scrubbed. Some of those bombs had fallen short, killing roughly 25 Americans and wounding more than 100. On July 25, when the weather finally held and the full weight of the air offensive came down, short bombing again struck friendly lines. 111 Americans were killed by their own bombs that morning, and nearly 500 wounded. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. When the bombers finally departed, the silence that followed was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a command structure that had ceased to exist. At 1100 hours, the United States First Army began to walk forward through the dust, and the German army in the west began to die. This is the story of why the men in field grey could not see what was coming. It is the story of how a generation of German generals, brilliant men, decorated men, men who had conquered Poland and France and stood at the gates of Moscow, found themselves blind, deaf, and mute as the Americans tore their front to shreds and raced 400 miles east in a single month. It is the story of an intelligence collapse, a doctrinal collapse, and a moral collapse, all happening at once. And it begins not on the battlefield, but in a small office in Berlin, where a quiet aristocrat with a pencil was writing reports that would help destroy the army he served. The German army of 1944 was, on paper, still a formidable instrument. It had marched into 11 countries. It had built a continental empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Volga. Its officer corps was the product of more than a century of professional military tradition, going back to the Prussian General Staff of Helmuth von Moltke. Its leaders had grown up reading Clausewitz. They had fought in the trenches of the First World War as young lieutenants and captains. They had rebuilt the army in secret during the 1920s. They had perfected the art of mobile warfare in 1939 and 1940, defeating the Polish army in 5 weeks and the French army in 6. To understand the Western Front in 1944, you must understand who these men were. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief in the West, was born in 1875. He had served the Kaiser as a young officer. He had commanded an army group in the invasion of France. He was 68 years old when the Americans landed in Normandy. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B, was the famous Desert Fox of North Africa, a soldier of extraordinary instinct and reach. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who would replace Rundstedt that summer, had commanded armies in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. Field Marshal Walter Model, the youngest of the senior commanders in the West, was a master of defense who had stabilized collapsing fronts in Russia again and again. These were not amateurs. They were among the most experienced soldiers alive. But experience is a double-edged weapon. The wars these men had won were wars of measured pace, wars of railway timetables and infantry march rates, wars in which a successful breakthrough advanced 50 kilometers in a week. The army they were about to face was different. It was an army built on more than 800,000 mass-produced 2.5-ton trucks, of which the GMC alone numbered more than 500,000. It was an army that could move a corps 100 miles in a single day. It was an army that did not march. It rode, and it was directed by commanders who, in the eyes of the German General Staff, were not even worth taking seriously. In the spring of 1944, German military intelligence on the Western Allies was the responsibility of a branch of the Army General Staff called Foreign Armies West. The man at its head was Colonel Alexis Baron von Roen, a Baltic German aristocrat from a family of soldiers and Lutheran pastors. Roen was thin, scholarly, devoutly Christian, and quietly anti-Nazi. He had been described as Hitler's favorite intelligence analyst. The reports he placed on the Führer's desk were considered authoritative. They were also catastrophically wrong. By June of 1944, Foreign Armies West was telling Hitler that there were close to 90 Allied divisions assembled in Britain, ready to invade France. The actual number was about 45. Roen and his staff were reporting an entire Phantom Army Group, the 1st United States Army Group, commanded by General George Patton, gathered in southeastern England and preparing to land at the Pas de Calais. That army group did not exist. It was a fiction created by British deception planners under the code name Operation Fortitude. Every wireless message it sent, every supply order, every troop movement reported by German agents was an Allied invention. The reason was simple, and from the German point of view, almost incomprehensible. Every single German agent operating in Britain had been captured, executed, or turned by British counterintelligence. Every one. The most prolific reporter to Berlin was a Spanish double-agent code named Garbo, working for the British, who fed Roen 500 messages in the months before D-Day from a network of 27 sub-agents that existed only on paper. Garbo's reports were so highly valued in Berlin that on July 29, 1944, the Germans awarded him the Iron Cross Second Class. He was, at the same time, a member of the Order of the British Empire, decorated by the British government for his service against the very intelligence service that had just decorated him in Berlin. The Germans never knew. Whether Roen understood what was happening to him is one of the unresolved questions of the war. Some historians have argued that he saw through the deception, kept silent, and inflated the figures to undermine Hitler. Others maintain that he was simply a victim of a system that had no way of checking its own work. Still, others believe the truth lies somewhere in between. The Luftwaffe could no longer fly reconnaissance over the British Isles in any sustained way. German signals intelligence had no agents to corroborate. The Abwehr, the traditional German intelligence service, had been broken up under suspicion of treason. Roen was working in a dark room with the lights cut. Whatever the truth of his motives, Roen's fate was sealed in the same month the Americans broke out of Normandy. After the failed plot to assassinate Hitler on July 20, 1944, the Gestapo arrested hundreds of officers across the Wehrmacht. Roen, whose deputy had been a conspirator, was among them. He was tried by Roland Freisler's People's Court and hanged at Plötzensee prison on October 12, 1944. He went to the gallows praying. The man who had been Germany's chief analyst of the Western Allies died, still believing that the British and Americans had armies in places they had never been. While Roen wrote his reports in Berlin, the war in the East had stripped the Luftwaffe to the bone. On June 5, 1944, the day before the Allied landings, the German air fleet defending France could field 481 aircraft of all types. The Allies put up more than 11,000 to support the invasion. By the spring of that year, the Luftwaffe was losing roughly a quarter of its fighter pilots every month. No air force in history had survived such a rate of attrition for long. The Luftwaffe consumed itself. What this meant for the men on the ground was that German commanders no longer had eyes. The art of operational command in the 20th century depends on knowing where the enemy is. By 1944, no German general on the Western Front could send an aircraft up in daylight to look. American fighter bombers, the men in the panzer divisions called them Jabos, owned the air to a depth of 100 kilometers behind the German front. A staff car moving by day was hunted within minutes. A panzer division could only move at night, on roads, in short rushes between hidden bivouacs. By the time a German corps commander received a report on enemy movements, the report was 12 hours old, and the enemy was already somewhere else. To this blindness was added a second affliction. Across the entire war, the Wehrmacht relied on roughly 2.75 million horses and mules. At any given moment in 1944, well over 1 million were still in service, pulling artillery, hauling supplies, dragging the German army forward at the pace of a draft animal. The American army, by contrast, was the most heavily motorized force in the history of warfare. American factories produced the trucks, ran them on American gasoline, and supplied nearly 400,000 of them to the Soviet Union as well. When the U.S. First Army broke through at St. Lo, The men chasing it were marching on foot or riding horse-drawn wagons. The men they were chasing were riding in heated cabs at 30 miles an hour. And there was a third affliction, the deepest of all. At the highest level of the German command structure, the man making the decisions was no longer a soldier. He was Adolf Hitler, sitting at a series of fortified headquarters in East Prussia and later in Western Germany, sending orders down by teleprinter, forbidding withdrawal, demanding counterattacks, threatening commanders with court-martial if they retreated a single kilometer. The professional officer corps, the men who had been trained to read the battlefield and adjust, had become couriers for a man who could not read it at all. This was the system that Operation Cobra was about to test. By the third week of July 1944, 6 weeks after D-Day, the Allies were stuck. The bocage country of Normandy, with its sunken lanes and 10-foot hedgerows, had reduced the campaign to a grinding infantry slog. American casualties were mounting. British and Canadian forces were locked in front of Caen. Field Marshal Klug, who had taken over from Rundstedt in early July, and from the wounded Rommel on July 17, told Hitler on July 22 that the front was about to collapse. Hitler ordered him to stand fast. 2 days later, the great air offensive began, and the next morning, July 25, the heavens fell on Panzer-Lehr. The commander of Panzer-Lehr was Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, a veteran of the Afrika Korps. After the war, in interrogation rooms and written manuscripts for the United States Army Historical Division, Bayerlein produced some of the most famous descriptions of the Cobra bombing in the literature of the war. He described the bombers coming in waves like a conveyor belt. He described his front lines as a landscape on the moon, with bomb craters touching rim to rim. He spoke of artillery positions wiped out, tanks overturned and buried, signal cables severed in every direction. He claimed that as much as 70% of his men had been killed, wounded, crazed, or numb. Modern historians have treated that figure as impressionistic rather than literal. Panzer-Lehr's actual losses on July 25 were closer to a third of its forward strength, and the division still had thousands of men and a small number of operational tanks the next day. But the shock effect on command and control was real. The division had ceased to function as a coherent fighting unit. The next morning, July 26, a staff officer arrived at Panzer-Lehr's forward headquarters near the village of Dangi, carrying an order from Kluge. Not a single man was to leave his position. Bayerlein's reply, as he later set it down for American interrogators, was bitter and direct. Out in front, he said, everyone was holding out. Everyone. His grenadiers, his engineers, his tank crews, all holding their ground. They were lying in their foxholes, mute and silent, for they were dead. He told the officer to report to the field marshal that the Panzer-Lehr division was annihilated. The American breakthrough that followed was not a tactical victory. It was a structural failure of the German army to comprehend what was happening to it. Within 72 hours, the U.S. 4th Armored Division had advanced 25 miles. The town of Coutances fell. By July 30, the Americans had turned the corner at Avranches and were pouring south and west into open country. On July 31, Klug sent a signal to Hitler's headquarters that has been quoted ever since. "It is a madhouse here," he said. The German front in Normandy had ceased to exist as a coherent line. On August 1, 1944, the United States Third Army was activated under the command of Lieutenant General George Patton. It is at this point in the story that historical fact and historical legend begin to part ways. The popular image is of German generals who had long feared Patton, who tracked his every movement, who recognized in him the most dangerous Allied commander. The actual record is different and more interesting. Until the summer of 1944, Patton barely registered in German intelligence reports. The first surviving German document mentioning him is a Foreign Armies West assessment from May of 1943 that noted he had taken command of a corps he had already left. A June 1943 report described him as an energetic and responsibility-loving command personality. That was the extent of it. What changed in August 1944 was not German intelligence. What changed was the speed of the American advance. Patton's Third Army did not surprise the Germans because they had underestimated him as a man. It surprised them because their entire information environment had broken down at the same moment that Patton was given his head. The dash across France in August of 1944 was historic. The U.S. 6th Armored Division advanced more than 200 miles into Brittany in a week. 7 divisions crossed the single bridge at Pont Ball in 72 hours. Patton himself wrote in his diary on August 14 that the Third Army had advanced further and faster than any army in history, a claim that flattered American achievement more than it accurately measured it against earlier German pursuits in Russia, but which captured the mood of the moment perfectly. On August 19, the 79th Infantry Division crossed the Seine at Mantes, the first American division to put men across that historic river. On August 25, Paris was liberated. By August 31, American spearheads were on the Meuse River at Verdun and Commercy. In a single month, the American front had moved 400 miles east. The German command tried to respond. On August 7th, on Hitler's personal order, Klug launched a counterattack code named Lüttich, aimed at retaking Avranches and cutting off Patton's army. The operation was opposed almost universally by the senior commanders who had to execute it. Klug himself protested the order in writing to Jodl at Hitler's headquarters, warning that the available forces could not break through, and that committing them in a westward attack would expose the entire German line in Normandy to envelopment. The objection was overruled. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park decrypted the German attack orders within hours of their issuance, giving Bradley about 3 days of warning. American defenders, especially the 30th Infantry Division on Hill 314 near Mortagne, held the dominant high ground against 4 panzer divisions for 6 days. Allied fighter bombers smashed the columns from above. The counterattack failed. Hitler later blamed Klug personally, claiming the field marshal had wanted it to fail. What followed was the encirclement that closed at Falaise. By the middle of August, 2 German armies, the 7th and the 5th Panzer, had been caught in a pocket that, days earlier, had measured roughly 35 miles long and as much as 20 miles wide. By August 18, the Allied jaws had crushed it down to a few miles across. American, British, Canadian and Polish forces compressed it from 4 sides. Allied fighter bombers cratered the roads. The estimates of German losses vary, and historians still debate them. Roughly 40 to 50,000 men were captured. Around 10,000 were killed inside the pocket. Between 20,000 and 50,000 escaped, mostly without their equipment. Post-war Allied investigators counted some 500 tanks and self-propelled guns left burning or abandoned in the pocket and the surrounding country, though most had been destroyed by their crews or run dry of fuel rather than killed by air attack. General Dwight Eisenhower, who toured the battlefield afterward, wrote in his memoirs that the scenes could be described only by Dante. It was literally possible, he said, to walk for hundreds of yards, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. Field Marshal Klug did not see the end. On August 15, he had been out of contact with his headquarters for hours, his staff car caught in an airstrike. Hitler concluded that he was negotiating with the enemy. On August 17, Walter Model arrived from the Eastern Front to take over both Army Group B and OB West. Klug began the long drive home in disgrace. Near Metz, on August 19, he stopped his car, took out a vial of cyanide, and killed himself. He left a letter for Hitler. "Both Rommel and I," he wrote, "and probably all the commanders in the West with experience of fighting the Anglo-Americans with their preponderance of materiel, foresaw the present development. We were not heeded." He pleaded with Hitler to make peace. "The German people," he wrote, "have suffered so unspeakably that the time has come to put an end to this dreadful struggle." Hitler read the letter and handed it to General Alfred Jodl. His recorded reaction was that, in his judgment, had Klug not killed himself, he would have been arrested anyway. Walter Model now had to do the impossible. He had to build a new front out of the wreckage of the old. The man who in the East had been called the Führer's fireman set to work in the West. Across the next 18 days, in what later became known as the Miracle in the West, Model pulled cadres back across the Seine, gathered remnants behind the West Wall, the old German border fortifications that had been stripped of their guns years earlier, and somehow rebuilt a defensive line. By late September, the German front in the West was holding again, from the Scheldt estuary in Holland to the Swiss border. It would not be broken decisively for another 5 months. He did it because the Americans ran out of fuel. By August 30, Patton's Third Army was receiving only 32,000 gallons of gasoline a day. He needed 400,000. The Red Ball Express, the famous truck convoy system that had supplied the advance, could not keep up at 400-mile range. Eisenhower's broad front strategy, and the priority given to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's drive into Holland diverted what fuel remained northward. Patton was halted on the Moselle River. After the war, German generals like Siegfried Westphal and Gunther Blumentritt would call this the miracle that saved the Western Front. They argued that until mid-October, the Allies could have broken through almost anywhere with ease. Modern historians treat that claim with caution. It was useful, after the war, for German generals to suggest that they had been beaten only by logistics, never by the enemy in front of them. The autumn campaign that followed bears out the caution. In Lorraine, the Third Army fought for 3 months in mud and rain against a German army that was no longer collapsing. The fortress city of Metz, which had not fallen to assault since antiquity, took most of November to reduce. The Battle of Aricourt in mid-September, in which 2 newly raised German panzer brigades attacked Patton's flank in fog, was an American victory, but not an easy one. The Germans lost more than 100 Panthers and almost as many other armoured vehicles. The Americans absorbed the blow with the experienced crews of the 4th Armoured Division, but the rapid advance of August was over. Behind the recovering German front, Adolf Hitler was already planning the operation that would, he believed, change the war. He had begun to think of it in early August. By late September, with Model's line stabilized, he was writing the directives. By the first days of November 1944, the assembly directive was ready, and Jodl sent it to Rundstedt, who had been recalled to OB West, with a covering letter. "The venture for the far-flung objective," Jodl wrote, "is unalterable, although from a strictly technical standpoint it appears to be disproportionate to our available forces." Hitler had written across the top of the document, in his own hand, the words not to be altered. The plan was Wacht am Rhein, the watch on the Rhine, the operation history would call the Battle of the Bulge. The objective was the port of Antwerp, 200 kilometers from the German line, across the Meuse River and through the Ardennes forest. The forces eventually committed to the offensive totaled some 410,000 men in 3 armies, with more than 1,400 armoured fighting vehicles, although the initial attack waves on December 16 would commit a fraction of that strength. Among them were 6th Panzer Army formations under Sepp Dietrich, 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel, and 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger. It was the last great German offensive of the war. Rundstedt and Model both opposed it. Rundstedt called it later a stupid operation that he had nothing to do with. Model said that the plan did not have a damned leg to stand on. Manteuffel of the 5th Panzer Army, the most thoughtful of the German commanders involved, criticized the artillery preparation and the entire concept of a deep drive to Antwerp, and proposed instead a smaller solution. Both Model and Rundstedt seconded that view, calling for a limited counterattack east of the Meuse to chew up American forces in the Aachen salient. Hitler ridiculed it as a half measure. They were ordered to execute his plan as written. What followed was the strangest intelligence achievement of the German armies last year. Hitler imposed total radio silence on the build-up. All movement orders went by buried Reichsbahn telephone lines, by motorcycle courier, by sealed teleprinter circuits inside German territory. Officers admitted into the planning circle signed oaths accepting death for any breach of security. Liaison officers were forbidden to fly. A broad cover story advertised a defensive battle in the west, suggesting that the German concentration east of Aachen was preparing to receive an Allied attack rather than to launch one. By December 11, Hitler had moved his own headquarters from East Prussia to the Adlerhorst bunker complex at Ziegenberg in central Germany, where he would direct the offensive in person. It worked. The Allies, who had grown so accustomed to reading German intentions through ultra-decrypts of high-level radio traffic, picked up nothing. They had indirect indicators, but no actual order. The 12th Army Group's intelligence summary on December 12 described the German front as thinner, more brittle, and more vulnerable than it appeared on the maps. On December 13, 14, and 15, scattered reports came in from American frontline units. A woman from Bitburg told an interrogator that the woods east of the Our River were jammed with German equipment. A captured German prisoner said that there would be an attack before Christmas. The reports were not connected. Air reconnaissance was grounded by the same fog that the Germans were waiting for. At 05:30 on December 16, 1944, the German artillery preparation began. The first hours of Wacht am Rhein were a catastrophe for American intelligence. 6th Panzer Army struck the 99th Infantry Division and elements of the 2nd Infantry Division in the north. 5th Panzer Army hit the 28th Infantry Division and the new 106th Infantry Division in the center. 7th Army screened the south. 3 days later, 2 regiments of the 106th, surrounded in the Schnee Eifel, surrendered en masse. Roughly 7,000 Americans went into captivity, the largest single mass surrender of American troops in the European theater. On December 17, Kampfgruppe Peiper of the 1st SS Panzer Division murdered 84 unarmed American prisoners at the crossroads of Bognes near Malmedy. The news of the massacre spread through the American front in hours and hardened resistance everywhere. But the German plan was already running behind schedule. In the north, the 6th Panzer Army, the Schwerpunkt of the offensive, he was halted within 48 hours by a stubborn defense that hardened into the joint stand of the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions on Elsenborn Ridge. Manteufel's 5th Panzer Army made better progress in the center, surrounding Bastogne by December 20. The 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division had reached the town just ahead of the Germans. They were now cut off. It was at this moment, on December 19, that Eisenhower called a council of war at the Verdun headquarters of 12th Army Group. The senior American commanders gathered around a map. Eisenhower asked who could counterattack into the southern flank of the German penetration. Patton, sitting with a cigar between his fingers, said that he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room fell silent. Eisenhower pushed the timeline to 72 hours and asked whether Patton was being theatrical. Patton was not. Earlier that morning in Nancy, before driving to Verdun, he had briefed his full staff and alerted his key subordinate commanders. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oskar Koch, and his planners had drawn up 3 contingency plans, with code names, for exactly this situation. Before Patton left for Verdun, he had handed those plans to his chief of staff and told him to wait for a phone call. Now Patton stepped to the phone, gave a code word to Brigadier General Hobart Gay in Nancy, and 100 miles of road movement orders went out across the Third Army. What he did over the next several days has become one of the most studied operations in modern military history. He turned 3 divisions, the 4th Armored, the 26th Infantry, and the 80th Infantry, 90 degrees northward. He moved them roughly 100 miles across icy roads, through traffic shared with retreating units, in just under 3 days. By December 22, the leading combat command was in position to attack. By the afternoon of December 26, at 1650 hours, Lieutenant Charles Boggess of the 37th Tank Battalion, in the lead Sherman tank named Cobra King, broke through the Assenois corridor and met the engineers of the 101st Airborne. The siege was lifted. The Germans had not planned for this. Their staff estimates had assumed the Americans would need at least 4 days to wheel an army of that size from contact with the enemy, reorient it 90 degrees, and attack along a new axis. Manteufel of the 5th Panzer Army, who would later describe the failure to American historians, had counted on the weather, the terrain, and the standard staff college timetable to give him the days he needed to reach the Meuse first. He did not get them. Patton's planners had cut the timetable in half. In the post-war interrogation rooms, German officers who had spent their careers studying mobile warfare were generous in their assessment of what had happened to them. They recognized in Patton's pivot the logic of their own doctrine, executed against them. Patton, said one senior planner, had given proof of extraordinary skill in armored warfare, conducted according to the fundamental German conception. It was the highest compliment a Wehrmacht officer could pay. It was also a confession. The German General Staff had quietly assumed that the speed of mobile warfare was something only their army could generate at the highest level. By the afternoon of December 26, that assumption was finished. The high water mark of the German offensive was reached on December 25, when reconnaissance elements of the 2nd Panzer Division ran out of fuel 4 kilometers from the Meuse near Celles and were destroyed by the US 2nd Armored Division. From that day forward, the bulge contracted. By the end of January 1945, the German line was back where it had started. German casualties came to between 80 and 100,000 men. American casualties, by the official Department of the Army count, came to roughly 108,000, including more than 19,000 killed. More important than the casualty figures was the loss of armor and the loss of fuel. The reserves Hitler had hoarded for half a year were burning in the snow. While the bulge was still raging, Winston Churchill cabled Joseph Stalin, asking him to bring forward the Soviet winter offensive in order to bleed German reserves away from the Ardennes. Stalin agreed. On January 12, 1945, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive 8 days ahead of its scheduled date. In 3 weeks, Soviet armies advanced 300 miles and reached the Oder River, 60 kilometers from Berlin. The panzer divisions that might have slowed them were rusting in Belgium. The German command's last chance to read the war and to react had been spent. What followed in the west was less a campaign than a collapse. Operation Veritable in the north, Operation Grenade in the center, Operation Lumberjack and Operation Undertone in the south, all in February and March of 1945, destroyed the German army west of the Rhine. German casualties in those 8 weeks ran to 400,000 men, including roughly 280,000 prisoners. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who replaced Rundstedt as OB West on March 11, inherited 26 divisions facing 90 Allied divisions. When he visited Army Group G's headquarters on March 13, the senior commanders told him that defending the Saar-Palatinate Triangle could only result in heavy losses or complete annihilation. Hitler ordered them to hold. In the middle of this catastrophe occurred the single most revealing failure of German command in the entire campaign. On March 7, 1945, the US 9th Armored Division reached the small Rhineland town of Remagen and discovered that the Ludendorff railway bridge across the Rhine was still standing. The story of how it remained standing is the story of the German chain of command at the end of its rope. After an American bomb had accidentally detonated demolition charges on the Mulheim Bridge in Cologne in October of 1944, Hitler had decreed a new procedure. Demolition explosives were to be stored 5 miles back from each bridge. They would be moved up only when the enemy was within 8 kilometers, and bridges would be blown only on written order from a named officer. The procedure had been written to prevent accidents. It produced paralysis. At Remagen, the chain of command had failed in advance. The corps commander of the sector, General Edwin von Rothkirch, had wandered into American lines the day before and been captured. The bridge was now nominally under a different corps headquarters, whose commander was 60 miles away. He sent a major named Hans Scheller forward with a small staff and a radio truck. The radio truck was lost en route. Scheller arrived at the bridge at 11:15 on the morning of March 7th, less than 2 hours before the Americans. The defenders consisted of about 1,000 men of mixed quality: regular troops, Hitler Youth, Volkssturm reservists, and Luftwaffe ground personnel. The bridge engineer, Captain Karl Friesenhahn, had requested 600 kilograms of military-grade demolition explosives. He had received 300 kilograms of Donnerit, a weak commercial mining explosive used in coal pits. At 1400 hours, he detonated a preliminary charge that blew a 30-foot crater in the western approach. At about 15:20, with American tanks visible at the western end of the bridge, Scheller finally gave the written order. Friesenhahn pressed the electric firing key. Nothing happened. The primary firing circuit had failed, possibly damaged by American shell fire. A corporal named Anton Faust ran out under fire to light the manual fuse. Only the southeastern pier charge detonated. The inadequate Donnerit failed to drop the bridge. American engineers, First Lieutenant Hugh Mott, Staff Sergeant John Reynolds, and Sergeant Eugene Dorland, ran across the span cutting wires and pulling out the remaining charges. Second Lieutenant Karl Timmermans, a company of the 27th Armored Infantry, crossed first. Sergeant Alexander Drabik, a former meat cutter from Holland, Ohio, was the first American soldier across the Rhine since the Napoleonic Wars. When word reached Bradley's headquarters, the 12th Army Group commander shouted into the phone to General Courtney Hodges. "Hot dog! Courtney!" he said. "This will bust him wide open." Eisenhower, when told, said that this was the best break they had had, and to get everything they had across the bridge. Within 24 hours, roughly 8,000 Americans were across. Within 10 days, 6 divisions and more than 125,000 troops had crossed the Rhine. At the Führer headquarters, the news produced first disbelief and then rage. Hitler ordered a flying court-martial. A general named Rudolf Hubner, with no legal training of any kind, was appointed both prosecutor and judge. He convened the court in a restaurant in the village of Bernbach. Within days, he had condemned 4 officers to death: Major Hans Scheller, Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters, Major Herbert Strobel, and Major August Kraft. Scheller and Peters were shot first, on March 14 at Rimbach. Strobel and Kraft were tried and shot 3 days later at Oberessen. All 4 men were killed by a single bullet to the back of the neck. Captain Friesenhahn, the engineer who had pressed the failed firing key, was acquitted. Captain Bracci, the combat commander, was sentenced to death in his absence. Within days, Kesselring and Model published the executions to every unit in the Wehrmacht as a warning. The Germans then tried to destroy the bridge they had failed to demolish. They fired V-2 ballistic missiles at it, the only operational tactical use of those weapons in the war. They sent Arado AR-2, 3, 4 jet bombers. They fired Karlgerah siege mortars throwing shells of 600mm caliber. They sent combat divers down the river. They flew 367 Luftwaffe sorties at the bridge. American anti-aircraft gunners shot down nearly a third of them. Nothing worked. The bridge collapsed of its own accord on March 17 at 1500 hours, weakened by 10 days of vibration and damage, killing 28 American engineers. By then, it had been irrelevant for a week. American pontoon bridges were carrying the traffic. While the Hübner court was shooting officers in the woods of the Westerwald, Patton was crossing the Rhine farther south. On the night of March 22, the 5th Infantry Division of his Third Army crossed at Oppenheim and Nierstein in assault boats, without preparatory artillery. While the 90th Infantry Division fainted at Mainz behind a smoke screen, Patton phoned Bradley the next morning. "Brad," he said, "for God's sake, tell the world we are across. I want the world to know Third Army made it before Monty starts across." Field Marshal Montgomery's set-piece Rhine Crossing, Operation Plunder, with 4,000 guns and the airborne drop of Operation Varsity, began the next day. Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary on March 24 that the situation in the West had entered an extraordinarily critical, almost deadly phase. By the first week of April, Allied forces had encircled the Ruhr industrial basin. The US 9th and 1st Armies linked at Lippstadt on April 1, trapping the bulk of Army Group B together with 2 corps of the 1st Parachute Army in the largest single capture of German troops in the West. Final prisoner counts ran between 317,000 and 325,000 men, surpassing even the German surrender at Tunisia in 1943. Walter Model knew what was coming. Hitler had on January 21, 1945, made every Army Group B division personally responsible to the Führer. As the pocket closed, the propaganda ministry publicly denounced Army Group B as traitors to the Reich. Model had also learned that the Soviet Union had indicted him as a war criminal for the deaths of more than 500,000 people in concentration camps in Latvia and the deportation of 175,000 to slave labor. In mid-April, he formally dissolved Army Group B. He ordered Volkssturm men and non-combatants to discard their uniforms and go home. He turned to his staff and asked whether everything had been done to justify their actions in the light of history. "What can there be left," he said, "for a commander in defeat? In ancient times they took poison." To his son Hans-Georg, he said simply that a German field marshal does not surrender. Such a thing, he said, is not possible. On April 21, 1945, Walter Model walked into a stand of trees between the towns of Duisburg and Lintorf. He took out a Walther pistol of small caliber. He shot himself once in the head. He was 54 years old. He had commanded armies on 3 fronts. He had stabilized collapsing situations in Russia that no other general had been able to hold. In the end, he could not stabilize the war he was in. The American advance reached the Elbe River on April 11, 1945. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division stopped 50 miles from Berlin. General William Simpson of the 9th Army asked permission to drive on the German capital. Eisenhower refused. He had already informed Stalin and General George Marshall in late March, in the cable known as SCAF 252, that Berlin was not his primary military objective at this stage of the war. Bradley estimated taking Berlin would cost 100,000 American casualties. The Soviet Army, at far higher cost, took it instead. On April 25, at 11:30 in the morning, First Lieutenant Albert Kotzebue of the 69th Infantry Division crossed the Elbe at Strela and met an intelligence patrol of the 58th Guards Rifle Division of the Soviet Army. Hours later, at the destroyed bridge at Torgau, a second American patrol shook hands with another group of Soviet soldiers in a meeting that would be staged for the cameras the next day. The Eastern and Western fronts had touched. 5 days later, Adolf Hitler shot himself in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. On May 7th, in a schoolhouse in Reims, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces. The war in Europe ended. The German army that had been defeated in the West in those 11 months from June 1944 to May 1945 was not defeated by a single battle or a single decision. It was defeated by an information environment that no longer functioned. The Luftwaffe could not see. The signals service could not hear. The intelligence branch was reading reports written in London. The chain of command was paralyzed by a Führer who forbade retreat and shot officers who failed. The trucks broke down. The horses starved. The roads were owned by enemy aircraft. And when the Americans moved, they moved in ways that the German General Staff had not been trained to anticipate, on timetables driven by mass-produced trucks, rather than by the marching speed of infantry battalions and the pulling power of horse teams. At the heart of the failure was a generation gap that no professional courage could close. The senior commanders on the Western Front had learned their trade in the trenches of 1916. They had refined it in the campaigns of 1940. They had assumed, deep in their training, that the speed of mobile warfare was something only the German army knew how to generate. By the summer of 1944, an entirely different industrial civilization, born in Detroit and Pittsburgh and Akron, had built an army that operated at a tempo their categories could not contain. They had no analytical framework for what they were watching. So they reached for the framework they had and called the Americans materially superior, as if it were only the trucks that were beating them and not the men driving the trucks, and the staff officers planning the routes, and the pre-prepared contingency plans waiting in headquarters at Nancy. Today the documents are open. The Foreign Military Studies series, written by captured German generals for American historians in the years after the war, fills shelves in the United States Army Heritage and Education Center at Carlisle Barracks. The interrogations of Brandenburger, Manteuffel, Westphal, Blumentritt, and Bayerlein are available to any researcher. The Bletchley Park decrypts have been declassified. The Garbo file at the National Archives in Kew records the Iron Cross awarded by a German service to an agent paid by the British. The Ludendorff Bridge towers at Remagen still stand on both banks of the Rhine, preserved as a peace museum that opened in 1980. The wooded ground where Walter Model died has been identified by local historians. Bastogne holds an American memorial in the shape of a 5-pointed star, dedicated in 1950. The lesson of the Western Front in the last year of the war is not that one side was clever and the other stupid. It is that command, in modern war, depends on information, and that information depends on systems, and that systems can be made blind. The German generals who lost the West were not lesser men than those who had won it 5 years earlier. They were the same men. What had changed was the world they were trying to read. The radio traffic they trusted had been broken. The agents they relied on were working for the other side. The aircraft they sent up did not come back. The tanks they ordered forward could not move by day. The orders they signed off in the morning were obsolete by afternoon. When Field Marshal Klug wrote his last letter to Hitler from a roadside in France, he asked the Führer to make peace. He did not ask out of cowardice. He asked because he had spent 6 weeks watching an army he had been told existed turn out to be a phantom, watching a counterattack he had been ordered to make collapse on the second day, and watching American spearheads cover in a week the distance his own divisions had taken months to cross in 1940. He had finally understood, as Rommel had understood before him, that the war was lost not in the field, but in the office. In the small room where Rohen's reports were written, in the larger room where Hitler refused to read them, in the mountain of paper that had told the German army a story about its enemy that bore no relation to the men who were now driving across France in heated cabs at 30 miles an hour. More than 800,000 American trucks and a few thousand decrypted messages had taken the war out of German hands. The professional courage of the men in field grey could not bring it back. Nor could their suicides. Klug in a roadside ditch near Metz, Rohan on a hangman's rope at Plötzensee, Model in a stand of trees near Duisburg, Hitler in a bunker in Berlin. 4 deaths in 9 months, 4 men who had once stood at the very top of a system that had finally seen, too late, what it could not read. The story they did not see in time is the story this account has tried to tell. It is the story of a war won not only by the soldiers who crossed the Rhine, but by the analysts who decrypted the codes, the deception planners who invented the phantom armies, the truck drivers who kept the spearheads fueled, and the staff officers who wrote the contingency plans that were waiting in a desk in Nancy when the call came. The men who could not read what was coming had been outmatched, not on the battlefield, but in the unseen architecture behind it. By the time they understood, their world was already ending in fire and snow and the long roads east, and the field marshals who had once mapped the conquest of a continent were writing their last letters and putting pistols to their heads. That is the lesson of the Western Front in 1944 and 1945. Command is not only what you order, it is what you can see and what you cannot.